I'm Elliot Chodoff, and welcome to Conflict Uncovered, your go-to podcast for in-depth analysis on the complex and dynamic conflicts shaping the Middle East, Israel, and the world. Join us as we delve into the latest developments, historical contexts, and the geopolitical forces at play. We bring you the insights you need to understand the issues that matter most. Stay informed, stay engaged, and uncover the truths behind the headlines. Hi, and welcome to Conflict Uncovered. It's May 8th, Friday, mid-afternoon, a few hours before Shabbat when we're doing this recording. I'm Elliot Chodoff, with me again, and as usual, my good friend and colleague, Zev Uslan. Zev, how's it going? I know you had an interesting week in Cyprus.
We did, Elliot, just briefly. We had to take a quick vacation because we got a refund from El Al that we didn't know we had coming. And we had to book within 5 days. And it was for $500. And the only place we could go for $500 was Cyprus. And it was a lovely, friendly, beautiful, high mountains, beautiful beaches place. Elliot, as I've been talking to people about the podcasts, I'm getting lots of inquiries and people pondering all that primarily you've been talking about, that how did October 7th happen? It's so easy for all of us to come to some sort of what we think may be an intelligent conclusion, but we don't have the knowledge. We don't have the facts. We don't have the history. We can read some articles and think we've done due diligence, but we haven't. And so I think we're all interested in pursuing for us non-professionals in the field, the complexity of what happened. What happened? I understand we know about the wars and we know about names of the bad guys, but we really don't understand the complexity of what led to this horror that to many of us feels like, without overstating it, over-dramatizing it, like somewhat the Holocaust. Not meaning to demean that term, but the horrors and the surprise and the
it was
history.
Catastrophic.
And so I would like to ask you to briefly review, only because the history is so complex for us, but also to keep on plugging away at what happened. Eventually we'll get to, hopefully, actually the October 7th.
As you know, we're calling this the long road because it is a long road. And I think it's an important recognition of a long road because two of the issues that recur in discussions, one is a question: how can an otherwise reasonably competent, good organization suffer a catastrophic failure? I'm talking about the IDF and the security services on the scale that it did over a period of, for our purposes, let's say 24 hours from the night of the 6th to the night of the 7th. Catastrophic failure is the only real way to describe it. And it's systemic. It's not a single individual's bad decision. That's a question. Can a system simply fall apart overnight? And I'm going to argue, no, it does not. The rot, and I'm going to call it rot, takes a long time, and it's a slow, insidious process. And insidious, I mean objectively insidious, not because it's being driven by malicious individuals. And the second sort of thread that goes through, and it's being raised again today with elections coming and trying to throw blame from one to another, the idea that an entire class of people, I'm talking about the high command of the military, as well as the upper echelons of the rest of the security services, the Shin Bet, Shabak, the Mossad, who dedicated their entire lives to the security of Israel, suddenly as a class committed treason. And And I'm not saying there cannot be traitors. I'm not identifying any, and I don't think there are in this case. But I'm not saying it is impossible for an individual to become a traitor. But to think that an entire, as I said, echelon of leaders committed treason is the uh, is what made Robert Ludlum's books so intriguing. Uh, but they're fiction, and anybody who's familiar with these people, and I have worked with my share of them over the years, particularly in my military service, realizes how outrageous and ridiculous that idea is. So it brings us back to how does a system and its leaders think that it's moving in the right direction when in fact it isn't? And the ultimate test, and we'll come back to this at another point, the ultimate test of a military is combat. It failed that test on October 7th. But what do you do in the interim? And now we're gonna move back into that period between 1982 and October 7th, when there is no large scale combat. What then affects the thinking, planning, design, behavior of a system, in this case, a military system, and its leaders?
As a psychologist talking to you, the military sociologist, military analyst, I'm aware that not only but I think many people love to use faux psychology to understand things that I think don't apply. Words like narcissist and self-centered and talking in a vacuum and other labeling terms as a means of trying to uh, grapple with, identify what happened. And I think as we talk, it's become more and more apparent that it's deeply complex and doesn't lend itself to labels. It doesn't lend itself to simple terminology. It doesn't lend itself to individuals did this. And I think
Correct.
it's very enlightening to have the systems approach, the historical approach to the whole thing. Thank you.
Look, the system is obviously made up of individuals, but it's individuals who are interacting with each other, with the system itself. It seems almost paradoxical. The system is made up of the individuals, but it is a system in itself. There are uh, there are psychological and social psychological effects going on here, uh, like confirmation bias, groupthink, and we'll talk about that as we get a little further along. Uh, but it's not the pathology of the individual of psychology that we're looking at here. And I think that there's another point that also needs to be made before we move on, apropos the leadership. And I can tell you this also from the experience of having been an officer, regular and reserve, active reserve, since 1985. And in the course of my military and civilian professional work, I've come in contact with a very large number of generals, not only Israeli, uh, American, Chinese, European of various types. And I can tell you unequivocally that I have never met a stupid general. I have met bad ones, but you don't make it up to that level in a sharp pyramidal organization structure by being anything other than outstanding. So as a class, we're talking about an elite. Once again, individuals are individuals, and every now and then a clunker is going to slip by for one reason or another. But none of them stupid, none of them incompetent. If they're bad, it's because they're using their competence in the wrong direction. And we'll talk about that as well as we go. But ultimately, that gets tested I'll come back to what I said before, in combat. And before I move on, just to give an interesting historical example, when the U.S. Army first engaged in combat in World War II in 1942 in North Africa, a relatively large number of generals were relieved of their commands. These are men who had moved up through the ranks in the 20s and 30s, become generals in the late 1930s, not having been generals in combat. They served in World War I as captains, lieutenants, whatever. And when they had to go into the field, commanding divisions and corps, they were not competent for the job, even though the system thought they were going in. And they were relieved. And the men who actually, for the most part, commanded the U.S. Army through World War II were a bunch of guys who were lieutenant colonels when the war broke out. And I'm talking about Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, names that are very well known historically. They were not generals in 1939. And they got promoted because they were competent. They were seen to be competent. They were tested and found to be competent, and not the people wearing the stars going into the operation. So the non-combat versus combat test, A, is not unique to Israel. It's universal. And B, it has been shown that transition shows up, not in all cases. Obviously, there were some who stayed in command and were shown to be competent, but a disproportionately large number who had been thought to be capable were not capable of combat command on the general level. So we're going to take a kind of a parallel look, of course, uniquely Israeli in Israeli history, of that period from the 1980s to October 7th. I want to go back. We talked about some of the stuff that went on in the 80s and into the 90s, the move toward quiet and peace along the borders, starting with the Egyptian peace treaty, ultimately improved relations and the peace treaty with Jordan. Syria kind of being left out simply because Syria was incapable of going to war without Egypt, and Egypt was out of the picture. Lebanon, always for our purposes, not a real threat as a country. So we have, for the first time in its history, Israel and its military is looking around at the borders and saying, we do not have an immediate state military threat facing us. That's number one. Number two, we also talked a bit about the intrusion of, or the inclusion of, depending on your perspective, industrial psychology as a means of looking at the system, and its emphasis on efficiency. The efficiency part is overlaid on another phenomenon that we didn't discuss, and that is the economic crisis that Israel goes through in the 1980s. When I moved to Israel, made Aliyah in 1983, it was already in that crisis. We were facing effective inflation of close to 1,000% a year. It was wild. Stores were changing prices twice a day. They weren't putting prices on the items on the shelves. As an individual, the only way you could not fall too far behind was by actually spending your paycheck before you got it, so that when the money that was devaluing was the bank's money and not yours. Holding cash in your wallet was as if trying to hold on to water in a sieve. And in the mid-'80s, here, credit where credit is due, finance minister was Shimon Peres. He put a brake on it. I don't want to go into everything that he did, but he put a brake on it with wage and price freezes, budget freezes, budget cuts, and the like. And that had an impact on the IDF. because the IDF was also cut, and it was cut deeply and sharply. The motto at the time, and I was in the Navy at the time, the Israeli Navy, as an officer, doing training and selection. And the motto of the IDF in those days was, "This is what we have. With this we will fight, and with this we will win." And they were pulling boats, I'm talking about missile boats, out of the water because they could not afford to maintain them as active fighting ships. And the same was happening all across the IDF. The only service I think that was not heavily hit was the Air Force. The Air Force is its own story. It's sort of its own place as the golden boy of the IDF. And I'm not saying that critically. It's an is. But the impact of those cuts on the general staff, on the rest of the system, was huge, because the question now became, how do we make do with what we have? And the sudden move toward efficiency played very well into that mindset. Okay, how do we simply do things cheaper and with less? And here again, when you're not facing regular combat, you can actually get yourself to believe that you're managing. That was a background that also takes well into the 90s. Another
Elliot,
event, yeah.
is there any correlation with the economic crisis in the 80s and the military and the First Intifada?
No. Although what you call the first Intifada, which I call the Intifada, I don't call the second one an Intifada, and we'll get to that. The 2000 terrorist war, which will also play into this story. The Intifada of December '87 that continues until the Oslo Accords of the early mid-90s was also the period of the rise of Hamas. That had an impact, along with what was happening in South Lebanon with Hezbollah, in that the military was now operating as a counterinsurgency quasi-police force rather than a full-scale maneuver army. In other words, all the fighting was now reduced to the level of small arms, light weapons, a bit of support here and there, artillery and air, but not much. A bit of support by tanks, not against the Intifada, but in South Lebanon, but not much. For the most part, the tanks were used in static positions as fixed artillery, direct fire artillery. In other words, there was no grand maneuver. We had established a security zone of outposts in Lebanon that I always refer to as the insecurity zone. Gaza and Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, it was essentially riot control policing. Not that it wasn't dangerous and didn't have a deadly impact, but it wasn't the war of 2000 that broke out, that's referred to as the Second Intifada. This was a lot of rock throwing, Molotov cocktails, and I'm not poo-pooing it in terms of its danger, but I am saying that from a military standpoint, you now have troops that are essentially riot control, and they're using riot control methods and techniques, tear gas, rubber bullets. They're no longer practicing proper infantry tactics, because that's not the target. Now, I've mentioned this in the past, and I think it's important to repeat. The IDF does not have a field professional non-commissioned officer corps. In other words, there is no senior sergeant who then brings everybody back afterwards and says, okay, boys and girls, listen, what we did today was all very interesting, but that's not what we're really supposed to be training and preparing for. This is how the platoon and the company operate in a real war. And that wasn't happening. And after a few cycles of that, and here also very important to keep in mind, the IDF, because of that weakness, because it does not have those field NCO professionals, the instructors in the training bases are also regular Army, and I use the word advisedly, kids. They are in their 3 years of service. They have no memory more than 3 years back. So what you have essentially is an organization with chronic amnesia, no institutional memory, and this is why it's so important that that generation that starts in the Palmach is gone by 1990. And now you've got this sort of cycling through and a tailing off. In other words, the officers who fought in 73 and then later in 82, by the 90s they're either way up in the system, which means having very little impact on the ground level, or they're out. They're gone. And the result is an army that is no longer training or thinking to do what it was doing in 1967 and 1973. Exercises begin to be cut back in scale. A divisional exercise is extremely expensive. So exercises are now reduced to brigade, and then from brigade down to battalion. The last brigade exercise that I observed was in the late 1990s. There were a few after that, but very few. And it now goes down to battalion level exercises. Now, this is very important also, not only in terms of large scale maneuver, but it's also important in terms of logistics. It's important in terms of communications. In other words, all combat support that is tested in a large-scale exercise and is practiced in a large-scale exercise stops being practiced. This also allows for the error in thinking that you can become more efficient in your logistics, because when you never have to run a full-scale war level of logistics, you say, you know what? I don't need all this much. I can cut it back. Yes.
I'm not sure I can articulate this, but I follow what you're saying. But we had major allies that had a different format that largely was successful. That could be debated. But didn't the American advisors or American colleagues or the Israelis who trained in the United States or vice versa, wasn't there some comparativeness or some reference to we're losing our mojo?
Oh, and I'll tell you why. First of all, the Americans always looked up to the Israelis, and for good reason. There's a famous anecdote, true, about Richard Nixon and Golda Meir, who had an excellent relationship, personal relationship. And at one point, before the Yom Kippur War, she was prime minister, he was president, and they were sitting and talking, and he turns to her and just sort of off the cuff says, if you could have 3 wishes, anything you want from America, what would you wish for? And without batting an eye, she turns to him and says, I would take 3 of your generals. And he says to her, our generals? Your generals are the best in the world. Which of ours could you possibly want? And she answers, General Motors, General Dynamics, and General Electric. And the Moshe Dayan image carries for a very, very long time. And the fact is, and I think this is also important, when the IDF does stuff on the scale that it's doing it, it does it very, very well. Entebbe, 1976. Right? It becomes the gold standard. Other things along the way, the Air Force is always carries it. The raid on the Iraqi reactor in 1981, etc. Gold standard. And that covers a multitude of sins. The other thing is that the IDF has always looked upon the U.S. military, and I know this, again, from the inside, as being slow, very heavy, there's truth to it. America doesn't need to be quick and fleet-footed like the IDF does. America can afford to lose. I'm not saying it's a good thing, and still walk away. Israel can't. And the Israeli officer corps turned its own culture and personality into a value. In other words, the Americans are not good at improvising, which isn't 100% correct, but we're tremendous at improvising. I always used to say to them, to us, because I'm part of it, yeah, we're great at improvising because we're just so bad at planning. And everybody would laugh. So that's also part of it. I want to touch on one more thing that goes into the mindset here, and mention one additional thing, and then we're going to pick up beyond next time. The Oslo Accords begin what is generally understood as the peace process. It becomes a mindset. It's a dream come true. It failed miserably, but it didn't really work its way out of the Israeli system until October 7th. And that becomes part of the thinking. The no more war, if you listen to the music of the 50s and 60s and the 70s, dreaming for peace, tomorrow there'll be peace, 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 which is wonderful. I'm in favor. This seemed to be the dream come true. It was, I call it a secular messianic era. And there was a sense of, we are now moving into a place where we don't need an army anymore. The idea that we're going to work it out. We pull out of Lebanon in 2000 following a campaign, and I'll just say this briefly, that builds around the idea of, we don't need to be in Lebanon because the north of Israel has not been attacked in over a decade, which wasn't 100% true, but it was an inversion. In other words, the reason the Galilee was safe is because the army was in Lebanon. And this logic of, we don't have to be there anymore because and Ehud Barak who was prime minister at the time, said, and I'm going to come back to him as well, because as chief of staff, he sort of sets the pace for where we're going to be going toward the 7th. But as prime minister, he says, we're going to pull back to the border, pull everybody out of Lebanon, and our policy is going to be, we're here and they're there. We're not going to bother them, and they're not going to bother us. And it's clear that he didn't read the large print, not the small print, the large print in Hezbollah's raison d'etre. And we're still dealing with it now in 2026. But it was this and the country went for it. The country thought it was a great idea. Why should they bother us once we're out of Lebanon? The only reason they're attacking us is because we're in Lebanon. It's like, but why did we go into Lebanon in the first place? Because we were being attacked from Lebanon. And this whole, okay, but we're now moving toward peace. We don't need this. We don't need to be there anymore. Becomes part of a mindset, and it becomes part of the military mindset as well. Keeping in mind that the military and society here are very, very closely related. So the last thing I'm going to throw out here is also Ehud Barak, but the early 90s as chief of staff. comes up with an idea that is very Barackian of redesigning the army as what he calls Sava Katan V'Chacham, a small, clever army. And this speaks very, very well to the budget cutters, the efficiency experts, and the like. In other words, he leads it, but he leads a movement that's already going. And that is going to take us over the next 30 years to October 7th.
Elliot, thank you. More to ponder. I hope in the next or the subsequent podcast, looking at it from 10,000 miles away originally and now ground zero, but the players never changed. Our perspective on them did, but the haters hated, the killers killed.
Yes.
And that's the confusing part to those of us who are trying to understand this, not just us, everybody, how we could delude, perceive that things had changed when, at this point anyway, it's so obvious it never did change. And so I hope we can discuss that next time.
Well, I'll rely on some of your professional skills to talk about things like wishful thinking.
Thank you, Elliot.
Thank you. With that, we'll close for today. To our listeners, thanks for being with us. And as always, stay safe, stay engaged. Thank you for listening to Conflict Uncovered. As always, it's been another rough day in the Middle East. We hope you found this episode insightful and engaging. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share and recommend with your friends, and review our podcast on your favorite platform. For more in-depth analysis and exclusive content, join our community and follow us on social media. Stay tuned for our next episode as we continue to explore the critical issues shaping the Middle East and the world. Until next time, stay informed and stay safe.